Some nurses think 8 months makes them special. It doesn't. It makes them probationary. That is what Dr. Whitfield said 17 minutes before everything changed at St. Michael's ICU in Houston. They didn't know. The staff moving through those hallways at 3 a.m. had no idea they were standing next to someone who had held a bleeding Marine in a bombed-out Fallujah clinic while shrapnel tore through the walls. They didn't know that the quiet nurse in scrubs, the one who never spoke during rounds, had performed combat medicine under live fire for 18 consecutive hours. The truth was being written right there in front of them, in the precise way her hands moved, in the deliberate choice of every graveyard shift, in a tarnished challenge coin hidden in a locker that told a story nobody would ever ask about. What happened in the next 72 hours didn't just silence the room. It changed everything. The fluorescent lights hummed their mechanical dirge, casting everything in surgical white. St. Michael's ICU smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, that particular mix that tastes metallic at 3 a.m., coating the back of your throat with the flavor of sterilization and human suffering. Megan O'Brien moved through the graveyard shift like water finding its own level, present without demanding attention. 8 months. She had been working St. Michael's for exactly 8 months, 2 weeks, and 4 days, though she never counted the hours. Time moved differently when you had already lived a different kind of life. The morning rounds began at 6:38 a.m., as they always did. Dr. Whitfield arrived with his white coat hanging like a cape, his stethoscope draped across his shoulders with the casual authority of a man who had never been questioned and saw no reason to start. He was tall, 6 feet 1 inch, Megan noted automatically, with the kind of jawline that came from generations of privilege and the kind of eyes that had never seen real consequence. His voice carried through the ICU like someone accustomed to every room quieting when he entered. Some nurses think 8 months makes them special, he said, not looking at anyone in particular but directing the words toward the cluster of nurses arranging charts at the station. It doesn't. It makes them probationary. It makes them liable to dismiss information they don't understand. He was already moving, already turning his attention to the patient boards, his shadow falling across the linoleum like a threat. Megan continued checking the full line on bed 9. Her movements were precise, gloved fingers checking the insertion site, eyes tracking the drip rate with a kind of focus that came from having once needed to know if a liter per hour variance meant the difference between a patient living to extraction or not. The fluorescent lights reflected off the 4 bag like stars through murky water. She didn't look up. Didn't acknowledge. Didn't let her jaw clench in a way that would telegraph anything. Dr. Whitfield moved through the ICU the way a predator moves through territory it already owns. Bed 3, respiratory failure, extubation candidate, his notes were efficient but offered nothing new. Bed 6, post-surgical, vital signs stable, his glance lasted maybe 9 seconds. Bed 9, cardiac monitoring only, he stopped longer here, said something to the resident about reading between the lines of patient presentation, whatever that meant. Then he moved on, and Megan released a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Bed 12 was different. The Army Ranger in Bed 12, Sergeant First Class Marcus Tate, though the ICU staff only called him the big guy, had been through 2 surgeries in the past 72 hours. Traumatic femur fracture, contaminated wound, infection risk still climbing despite the broad-spectrum antibiotics. He was delirious this morning. Not sleeping, not resting, but cycling between moments of clarity and moments where his eyes moved like a man watching something nobody else could see. He was 308 pounds, built like load-bearing equipment, with the kind of hands that suggested he had spent his life breaking things that needed breaking. He's been agitated since 2 a.m., Dr. Whitfield announced, his voice carrying the tone of a man presenting evidence in a trial he had already won. Temperature holding at 102.3. He's ripping at lines again. He's a liability at this point. Megan looked up. Not challenging, not raising her voice, just asking the question that was necessary. Did the resident get a culture before the fever spiked? And his last set of vitals? Dr. Whitfield turned. The room seemed to shift slightly, the way air pressure changes when a storm door opens. His eyes found hers with the precise focus of something that had just identified prey. I'm sorry, I didn't catch your name. He hadn't. He had made a point of not learning it. Megan. She didn't add her title. Didn't say nurse. Didn't offer anything extra. Right. Megan the probationary. He turned back to the patient board as if he had already finished the conversation. I'm ordering versed. 5 milligrams for. He needs sedation. He needs to stop fighting. I need the line stable, and I need infection control. Megan set down the 4-bag. Her hands were steady. The scar that ran from her left wrist to her elbow, ragged white line from shrapnel in 2006, from a moment in Fallujah when a colleague had been hit and she had kept her hands moving for 6 more hours before anyone could convince her to leave the operating area, caught the fluorescent light as she moved. She didn't cross her arms. She didn't lean away. She just asked the question. Has he been assessed for drug interactions? His chart says he's on 3 different pain medications. Versed on top of that combination might. Might what, Megan? His voice had that quality now, the one that told you he was enjoying this. Might compromise your innovative approach to patient care. The resident, young, nervous, clearly already calculating which way the wind was blowing, looked at her boots. It might compromise his respiratory function, Megan finished. He's already hypoventilating. Sedation could push him into the red. Dr. Whitfield smiled. It was the smile of someone who had already decided the outcome. Then we'll be prepared for that possibility. Write the order. He said it to the resident, but he was still looking at Megan. Probationary period means learning to recognize the limits of your expertise. Consider this a lesson. He moved on. The rounds continued. Bed 13, bed 14, bed 15. The words flowed past like water, and Megan returned to her for checks, her pulse staying steady, her breathing staying even. This was a thing she knew how to do. Stay quiet. Stay methodical. Let people underestimate the silence. The day shift took over at 7 a.m. Megan stayed for the handoff, always did, and was about to head to the break room when she saw the ranger in bed 12 wake up, his eyes clearing for a moment before the delirium rolled back in. She made a note. 15 seconds of lucidity before the fever took it again. She filed that detail away in the same place she kept all the other details, the ones nobody else was collecting. At 2:13 p.m., Megan made her request. No explanation, no justification, just a simple statement during the evening shift briefing. I'd like to pick up the graveyard shift tomorrow. And next week if possible. I prefer overnight. The charge nurse looked up, surprised. You sure? Most people try to get off nights, not request more. I prefer overnight. Megan kept her voice level, kept her hands busy organizing the supply cart. Less traffic. Easier to think. What she didn't say was that bed 12 needed someone who could recognize the difference between medication side effects and infection progression. What she didn't say was that an Army Ranger with a 102.3 fever might wake up clear enough to need help before things got worse. What she didn't say was that she had spent the last 8 months positioning herself next to this specific patient in this specific hospital, waiting for this specific moment, and the moment was now beginning to unfold. The shift supervisor nodded. I'll put you down through the end of the month. You're reliable, at least. That's something in this place. Megan finished with the supply cart and headed to the locker room. The hospital after 3 p.m. had a different quality. The exhaustion was thicker, the decisions were getting smaller, the weight of the day was pressing everyone down just a little harder. She opened her locker, moved aside her spare scrubs, and touched the tarnished challenge coin she kept there. The metal was cool against her fingertips. It was scored and dented, the eagle and anchor barely visible anymore, the inscription on the back completely worn away. She had gotten it in Fallujah in 2006 from a lieutenant commander who had handed it to her on a runway just before they medically evacuated her for her wounds. She had never looked back. Dr. Whitfield was in the hallway outside his office when she was leaving. He was reviewing notes, his focus entirely on the paperwork, but she saw him. The way his eyes tracked to the left, registering her movement. The almost invisible nod of his head, as if confirming something he had already suspected. His hands were neat, uncalloused, the kind of hands that had only ever held pens and had never held anything that was trying to die. He had no idea that she had spent 18 months operating in the worst place she had ever seen, cutting men open without general anesthesia because the helicopters weren't coming and the morphine ran out and you made do with what you had. He had no idea that she had learned to recognize the moment between recovery and collapse the way other people recognized voices. He had no idea that there was someone in his ICU who could do things with her hands that would make his credentials seem like a child's certificate from a summer camp. But that didn't matter yet. Not for another 48 hours. Right now, she just needed to get home, sleep through the rest of the afternoon, and be ready for 7 p.m. tomorrow when the night shift started and she could finally take her position where she had been planning to be all along. The silence in the locker room lasted exactly 3 seconds. Then Megan closed the metal door with a soft metallic click and walked out into the Houston heat, her footsteps echoing on the polished floor like a countdown nobody else could hear. The conference room at St. Michael's smelled like antiseptic and coffee and the particular staleness that comes from 27 people breathing recirculated air for 3 hours straight. Grand rounds. 23 residents arranged in careful hierarchies, for attending physicians seated in the front row like judges at a tribunal, and Megan O'Brien standing against the back wall where she could see everything and blend into the beige paint. Dr. Whitfield stood at the podium with her patient notes projected on the screen behind him. The 300-pound Army Rangers chart. Bed 12. The reason she'd volunteered for the graveyard shift 8 months ago, the reason she'd endured every dismissal and cold shoulder, the reason she was here at all. Let's discuss what happens. Whitfield's voice carried the confidence of a man who'd never been wrong about anything, when nurses, particularly new nurses, decide hospital policy doesn't apply to them. He circled her note with a laser pointer. The sedation concern. The question she'd asked quietly, professionally, based on 18 years of trauma medicine she could never admit she'd received. Nurse O'Brien here believes her 8 months of experience supersedes my 15 years. She questioned a direct order in front of residents. He turned to face the amphitheater, letting that hang in the air like an indictment. Can anyone tell me what we call this? A resident in the third row, young, eager to please, insubordination, sir. Exactly. Whitfield smiled. His smile was the smile of a man whose father golfed with hospital board chairman. The Ice Queen here thinks she knows better than the attending physician. This is what happens when we don't maintain hierarchy. When we don't remind staff of their lane. He glanced back at her. Nurse O'Brien, what do you have to say for yourself? Megan's jaw clenched once, barely visible. A muscle flexing and releasing. Her hands were clasped behind her back, knuckles white but steady. She'd held better men than Whitfield together with her own hands. She'd run trauma ops in Fallujah where a single mistake meant someone's child wouldn't come home. She'd worn a uniform that represented something he'd never understand. So she simply looked at him and said nothing. Her face went blank as winter stone. She documented everything on her tablet instead. The condescension. The lie about 15 years, it was actually 13. The way he performed his superiority for the residents, teaching them that arrogance was professionalism, that dismissing concerns was confidence. She wrote it all down with the precision of someone building a case file, as if she were observing a case study on hospital dysfunction instead of being the case study itself. The room felt smaller around her. Oxygen thinning. But her breathing stayed even. Her eye stayed flat. The Ice Queen absorbed the cold and gave nothing back. 2 hours later, near the third-floor vending machines, 2 residents were laughing loud enough to fill the corridor as Megan passed with a cup of coffee. She would have walked past them without acknowledging their existence, except that she heard her own name folded into their mockery. $20 says the Ice Queen couldn't handle a real code, one of them said, feeding dollar bills into the machine. She'd probably freeze up, start citing protocol instead of pushing epi. The other one snorted. Nah, man. She'd file a formal complaint about proper procedure while the patient coded. "Doctor, I must object to your deviation from AHA guidelines while this man expires." They laughed like wolves. The kind of laughter that came from never having real consequences, from never understanding that somewhere, right now, a 300-pound Army Ranger was bleeding out in a hospital bed because he'd been exposed to something he shouldn't have been exposed to, and she was the only person on this floor who could keep him alive. Dr. Whitfield approached from behind them, coffee in hand, moving like a man with no obstacles in his path. The resident straightened immediately. He waved them away with a gesture that was almost affectionate, the master indulging his apprentices. Then he turned to her. "Nurse O'Brien, walk with me." It wasn't a request. It was a command phrased as an invitation, the way men like Whitfield always phrased their threats. She followed him down the empty hallway, their footsteps echoing off linoleum that gleamed under fluorescent lights. He stopped at the supply closet and stood too close, backing her against the wall with the kind of invasion that was technically legal because the door was open and there were witnesses if she screamed. "One more policy violation," he said quietly, "one more instance of you playing doctor, and security will escort you out of this building. Am I clear?" His breath smelled like expensive coffee and the particular sourness that comes from thinking you've already won. "You don't belong here, Nurse O'Brien. You never did. And everyone knows it." She met his eyes. Actually met them. Looked at him with the kind of calm that comes from having stared down worse things in darker places. "Crystal clear, Doctor." Her voice was flat. Completely empty. Not angry, not wounded, not anything he could use. Just information delivered in monotone. It made him uncomfortable, she could see it in the tightening around his eyes. He'd wanted her to tremble. He'd wanted her to break. Instead, she'd given him nothing at all. He left. Of course he left. Men like that always did, once they realized the game wasn't working. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she stood there in the supply closet for another 8 seconds after he was gone, hands gripping the edge of the metal shelf, calculating how his interference might compromise her entire mission. The Ranger in bed 12 was supposed to be stable. He was supposed to stay stable long enough for the intelligence briefing scheduled for Friday. But Whitfield's harassment was creating documented friction, creating a record, creating exactly the kind of attention that could blow her cover into pieces. She drove home that night in her 10-year-old Honda Civic with 147,000 miles on the odometer, the kind of car that didn't draw attention, that belonged to people who worked overtime and had rent payments. In the hospital parking garage, alone in the dark with the engine running, her hands finally shook. Actually trembled against the steering wheel like they belonged to someone else's body. Her shoulders dropped. Her breathing changed. For exactly 60 seconds, the Ice Queen melted. Then she straightened up. Wiped her hands on her scrubs. Turned the key and drove through the humid Houston night toward an apartment where nobody knew her name and nobody asked questions. At 2:13 a.m., her phone buzzed with a code alert. The Ranger. Bed 12. Code blue. She was dressed and in her car in 4 minutes. Back at St. Michael's in 7. The graveyard shift was already cascading into controlled chaos when she arrived, nurses moving like automatons, the overhead system screaming code blue trauma bay, the particular electricity that comes when everything you can control is slipping. She found him thrashing violently in bed 12, 310 pounds of Army Ranger moving with the desperate strength of a man who was somewhere else entirely. His central line was ripped out. His arterial catheter was loose, spraying blood across the monitors like a broken sprinkler system. 2 male nurses were trying to restrain him, but he threw one of them into a crash cart with a kind of casual power that only comes from 17 years of combat training and current hypovolemic shock painting his decisions with delirium. Megan assessed the situation in 3 seconds. Arterial bleed. Blood loss at this rate meant for minutes until cardiac arrest. ICU psychosis mixed with combat-trained muscle memory, he was fighting something only he could see. He was dangerous. He was also dying. She didn't call for backup. She moved. What happened next took 7 seconds but would replay in security footage for months, dissected by intelligence analysts who would never fully understand what they were watching. Megan stepped inside his reach, redirected his momentum with a joint lock her body remembered from SEAL close-quarters combat training, used his own weight against him like a lever against physics, and took him to the floor in a controlled descent that was simultaneously brutal and precise. Her knee pinned his shoulder. Her hand controlled his head with pressure points that brought instant submission without injury. Her voice dropped into a register that cut through delirium like a blade through silk. "Sergeant, you're stateside. Stand down." He went still instantly. Muscle memory recognizing authority. Combat-trained obedience. She maintained the hold while calmly instructing staff in a voice that was suddenly, unmistakably, a voice that gave orders: "Get me a pressure dressing and 2 units ONEG. Now. Fluid line, wide bore, and push 1 mg epi through the 4. Move. Not requests. Commands." They moved like her words had weight. 6 hours later, at 6 in the morning when the shift was starting to breathe again and the Ranger was stabilized and sleeping, Megan was changing his chest dressing when his eyes opened. Really opened. The delirium was gone. Just a man looking at a woman who'd stopped him from dying in a way that wasn't medical training. He grabbed her wrist. Gently. Carefully. Like he was holding something that might break. "That wasn't nursing school," he said quietly. "I know that hold. And that suture pattern on your arm." He looked at the small scar visible above her glove line, specific to a blast injury that had left fragments embedded in her forearm that she'd never had removed because they were classified as part of the operation. "You ran trauma ops in Fallujah, didn't you? 2006, Task Force Black." Megan's face went completely blank. She removed his hand with clinical precision. "You're confusing me with someone else, Sergeant. The morphine causes vivid memories." She kept her voice professional. Distant. The nurse voice. But her hands paused for half a second on the dressing. Just half a second. A moment of recognition that maybe the mission was about to unravel, that maybe this man had just connected dots that were supposed to stay disconnected, that her tarnished challenge coin hidden in her locker was about to become evidence of everything she'd been hiding. He saw it. Of course he saw it. Men like him were trained to see everything. And that's when the real nightmare began. The lucid moments came without warning. Tate's eyes would clear for 30 seconds, maybe a minute if the morphine was wearing thin, and in those windows of consciousness, a man emerged who wasn't thrashing or sedated or caught between fever dreams and the machinery keeping him alive. On a Tuesday morning at 6:33 a.m., while Megan changed the dressing on his chest, Tate's hand moved with surprising strength. Not violent. Deliberate. His fingers closed gently around her wrist, and his voice came out rough as gravel under tires. "I know that suture pattern." Megan's hands froze. The old sterile gauze hung suspended between her fingers and the surgical site, a clean line of stitches that had been placed with the precision of someone who'd done it 1,000 times in conditions far worse than a sterile hospital room. "You ran trauma ops in Fallujah, didn't you?" The room didn't move. The ventilator wheezed its mechanical rhythm. Somewhere down the corridor, a monitor beeped in steady intervals, counting heartbeats that didn't belong to her. Megan's mind conducted a 3-second calculation: what he knew, what he could prove, what happened to deep cover operations when the subject made the connection. She met his eyes for exactly 1 second, long enough to see recognition there, the way a soldier sees another soldier, then her face went blank. The warmth drained from her expression like someone pulling a shade. When she spoke, her voice had become something else entirely, the voice of a woman who knew nothing, cared nothing, existed nowhere except in this moment. "You're confusing me with someone else." She turned back to the dressing. Her hands moved. Steady. Each motion precise: tape, gauze, tape again, the work of someone whose muscle memory had no connection to her mind. Tate's grip on her wrist loosened. She didn't look at him again. Not once. That was the essential skill of deep cover, the ability to erase yourself mid-sentence, to become transparent, to make a person forget they'd ever seen you at all. By the time she finished and stepped away, Megan O'Brien, the civilian nurse, was fully operational. Master Chief Petty Officer O'Brien, the one who'd held Ranger eyes in the Jolin district and asked questions that got classified answers, didn't exist in this room anymore. But Tate had seen her. And seeing cuts both directions. That same afternoon, Dr. Whitfield sat in a small conference room adjacent to the ICU with a tablet in his hands and an expression that resembled satisfaction the way a shark resembles a smile. Beside him sat Patricia Chen, Chief of Staff, whose signature controlled hospital expenditure and whose disapproval of Whitfield had been legendary since his second malpractice settlement. Across from them, the hospital administrator James Bancroft scrolled through security footage on his own screen, his jaw moving in that tight, thoughtful way of men who were already calculating institutional liability. "Play it again," Whitfield said. Bancroft rewound. On the grainy hospital monitor, dated 11:34 p.m., timestamp glowing in the bottom corner, the Ranger patient appeared mid-thrash, for lines tearing, his massive frame bucking against gravity and morphine and the iron will of a human body refusing to be still. A nurse appeared. Megan. She moved toward him without hesitation, without the cautious approach that standard training taught. Instead, she approached the way someone approaches a live grenade they need to disarm. Her hands, there. Watch her hands. She placed her left palm against his right shoulder, pressing him back into the bed. Not forcefully. Strategically. She knew exactly where the rotator cuff would resist, where the leverage would work. Her right hand moved to his left arm, and with a movement that lasted maybe 2 seconds, she executed what Whitfield would later describe to his personal investigator as a trained restraint technique. It wasn't a restraint technique. It was a combat takedown. It was the kind of thing taught in Army SEER schools and SEAL qualification courses and places where the government trained people to survive and resist and hurt things efficiently. But to Dr. Whitfield's eye, untrained in violence, unburdened by humility, entirely convinced of his own diagnostic superiority, it looked like evidence. Evidence of scope creep. Evidence of unauthorized practice. "Look at that technique," Whitfield said, leaning forward with the intensity of a predator who'd caught a scent. "That's not de-escalation training. That's military combat. Standard nursing education doesn't produce movements like that. That's trained motor memory." Patricia Chen's expression remained neutral. She'd been chief of staff for 7 years and had developed the particular skill of appearing to listen while making zero commitments. Bancroft, however, was already making the calculations, liability assessments, compliance questions, the particular terror of institutions discovering they'd employed someone operating outside their legal framework. Her employment history, Whitfield continued, is suspiciously minimal. She arrived here 8 months ago. Before that? Nothing. No previous hospital postings in Texas. No nursing school records in the system. Social security number exists, but her digital footprint is almost non-existent. She volunteered for graveyard shift immediately. She avoided all social interaction. She positioned herself specifically near that ranger's bed. "You think she's, what?" Chen asked, her voice carrying the tone of someone who needed to hear the accusation stated outright before she could take it seriously. "I think," Whitfield said, "that we have a potential liability in this unit who may be operating under a false name with fraudulent credentials. And if that comes out, and we knew, and we did nothing? The hospital's exposure is significant." Bancroft was already composing an internal email in his head. He'd been doing this job long enough to recognize a coming storm. "We need to investigate her background. Formally. HR should pull her file, and we should consider whether she should continue operating in the ICU pending." "Pending discovery," Whitfield interrupted, and there was something almost musical in his voice now, a man watching a problem solve itself. "I'd also recommend we contact the Texas Nursing Board. If she's practicing outside her license scope, that needs to be documented. Officially." Patricia Chen looked at both of them. The room's fluorescent lights hummed with the particular frequency that made you feel watched, judged, slowly being drained of certainty. She knew something was happening here that went beyond scope of practice. She also knew that once the paperwork started, once the board got involved, momentum became a force unto itself. "I'll call the board," she said quietly. "Today." That afternoon, while hospital administrators began the machinery that would either expose Megan or bury her, she received a message on the secure device, a prepaid phone hidden in the spare tire well of her 2019 Honda Accord, parked in the staff lot on the far side of the hospital where cameras had a blind spot. The message came through an encrypted channel and contained 3 words. "Extraction protocol initiated." Megan read it once. Memorized it. Deleted it. Then sat in her car in the Texas heat with the windows up and her hand steady on the steering wheel, processing what it meant. Her mission was compromised. Sergeant Tate had made her. Which meant the entire intelligence operation, 2 years of deep cover work, for previous assignments to build her legend, every credential forged, every background checked, every moment of public humiliation absorbed and catalogued, was now burning. She had 72 hours to extract the intelligence Tate carried before his transfer to Walter Reed. The testimony locked in his memory, eyewitness accounts of war crimes committed by a private defense contractor in Fallujah, documentation that could secure prosecutions, was the only evidence that could move the needle on cases that had been sitting in prosecution limbo for 18 months. If she was removed from St. Michael's before that debrief happened, if she lost her access to him, the perpetrators walked free. Justice folded. The operation dissolved into the particular tragedy of intelligence work, information that matters, discovered too late. That night, at 11:43 p.m., Tate's monitor began its urgent percussion, beep beep beep, then suddenly something worse. The rhythm on the screen became chaos. Ventricular fibrillation. His heart had stopped generating pulses. It was generating noise. Megan was changing for fluid bags 3 beds away when the alarm registered. Her body moved before her conscious mind caught up. She was at his bedside in 6 seconds flat. The monitor showed flat line with intermittent spikes, electrical activity with 0 perfusion. His skin was already cooling. The responding resident, a younger man named Dr. Patterson, maybe 2 years out of medical school, hands already starting to shake, was reaching for the defibrillator pads. 200 joules, Patterson said, and the machine charged with that particular high-pitched whine. The shock went in. Megan watched the monitor. The body bucked. Flat line persisted. "No change," she said quietly. The resident was already resetting. 300 joules. The shock. Again. The body. Again. Flat line. Time was now a ticking clock with a specific deadline. 90 seconds. That was the window before cellular death started climbing the brainstem. After 90 seconds, even if you got him back, you got back a body with a different brain inside it. "We need to call the attending," Patterson said, reaching for the phone, and there was something in his voice that sounded like surrender already settling in. Megan looked at the monitor. Looked at the patient. Looked at the equation that was presenting itself with the clarity of tactical calculus. Dr. Whitfield would take another 4 minutes to arrive, if he arrived at all. The attending cardiologist was in Milwaukee. The resident in front of her had standard training and no component of crisis confidence. And in exactly 45 seconds, irreversible brain damage would begin its work. "No," Megan said. The word came out with the particular authority of someone who wasn't making a request. Patterson's hand froze on the phone. He turned and looked at her, and what he saw in her face was something that didn't quite match the timid nurse who'd been requesting assignments and keeping her head down for 8 months. What he saw was someone stepping into a decision that would end her career one way or the other. "Get me a crash cart," Megan said. 14-gauge needle, open the chest tray. Now. Patterson moved. He didn't question it. That was the thing about authority, real authority. It had a tone that bypassed every institutional hierarchy and went straight to the nervous system of people trained to recognize it. The crash cart rolled. Megan's hands were already pulling the medication, 1 milligram of epinephrine, drawn up and ready, and she was already assessing the geometry of Tate's chest, finding the landmarks that muscle memory remembered even when her official credentials pretended complete ignorance. 40 seconds until irreversible damage. And that's when the quiet became something else entirely. 40 seconds until irreversible damage. And that's when the quiet became something else entirely. Megan's hand moved to the crash cart. Not asking. Not hesitating. The monitor screened VFib, the jagged, chaotic rhythm of a heart that had abandoned its electrical map entirely. 2 defibrillation attempts. Nothing. Sergeant Tate's pupils were fixed and dilating. His brain was dying in real time, 1 second per minute of no perfusion. The resident, Dr. Kemp, fresh out of medical school, 3 months into his first year, stood frozen beside the bedside monitor, his hands trembling as if they belonged to someone else. His mouth opened. Closed. We should call for the attending. We need the attending physician. Megan was already moving. She didn't say yes or no. She didn't ask permission. She pulled the thoracotomy tray from the crash cart with movements that looked casual to anyone who hadn't spent 18 months operating under fire in Fallujah. The tray hit the bedside table with a sharp metallic clink that made 2 of the nurses flinch. Code is for minutes in, Megan said, her voice dropping into a register that sounded like it came from someone else entirely. Standard ACLS protocols have failed twice. We do a thoracotomy now or we're calling time of death. She was already prepping Tate's left chest with betadine, the antiseptic creating a dark amber spiral across his pale skin. The smell of iodine filled the cramped ICU room, sharp, medicinal, the scent of commitment. Dr. Kemp's eyes went wider. Nurses can't perform surgical procedures. That's scope of practice violation. You need. The scalpel was in Megan's hand. The cut was perfect, following the 5th intercostal space, the blade moving with absolute precision, the kind of precision that comes from hands that have done this under conditions infinitely worse than a controlled hospital room. Controlled depth. Minimal tissue damage. The incision opened clean, 2 inches, following the anatomical landmarks that lived in her muscle memory. Rib spreaders. The metallic spread of the chest opening. The resident made a sound like a man choking. Megan's hands entered Tate's chest cavity with the terrifying fluid precision of someone who had already survived the worst. Her right hand found his left ventricle. Her fingers wrapped around the organ with absolute control. No hesitation. No doubt. Just the practiced grip of hands that had held lives together in worse places. Direct cardiac massage. She squeezed. Released. Squeezed. Released. 40 compressions per minute, each one firm enough to push blood through his body, soft enough not to rupture the organ. Her face was blank, her breathing steady, her movements impossible for any civilian nurse to execute. This wasn't learned in nursing school. This was muscle memory written in shrapnel and blood and 18 months of operating in a combat hospital where the attending physicians were 200 miles away and the only thing between your patient and death was the person standing over them. 20 seconds. The monitor still showed VFib. Megan kept squeezing. 30 seconds. Her hands moved with the terrifying calm of apex predators closing on prey. Controlled. Certain. Lethal in purpose. 40 seconds. The heart stuttered beneath her fingers. A single contraction. Chaotic. But there. Then another. And another. The monitor shifted. The jagged line smoothed into something organized. Sinus tachycardia, fast, organized, the kind of rhythm that meant the heart was working again. Tate's blood pressure spiked on the monitor. His oxygen saturation climbed. 78, 82, 87. Rhythm restoration at 23:27, Megan said, her voice level as water. 2 units packed cells, get them running. I need cardiothoracic here for formal closure. She didn't remove her hands. She was still performing direct massage, still supporting his newly restored heart, still the only thing keeping him alive. Page them now. Not in 2 minutes. Now. One of the nurses, the older one, Rodriguez, was already moving, her phone to her ear. The other nurse, the young one whose name tag read Patterson, stood with her mouth open, staring at Megan's hands inside Tate's chest cavity like she'd just witnessed someone walk on water. Dr. Kemp was the color of old concrete. The sound of running feet. Voices in the hallway. The code had drawn attention. But when Dr. Whitfield walked through the ICU doors, his expression shifted from professional concern to something else entirely. Something cold. Something calculating. He surveyed the scene. Megan's hands inside Tate's chest. The open thoracotomy. The perfect technique. The organized rhythm on the monitor. The restoration of a heartbeat that should have stopped 3 minutes ago. His jaw tightened. His face went pale. For exactly 3 seconds, he didn't move. Then, step away from that patient. Now. Not a question. Not a request. A command delivered in the tone of a man whose authority was being shattered by someone he'd convinced himself was beneath him. Megan didn't look up. Cardiothoracic is 90 seconds out. I'm supporting his cardiac function until they arrive for formal repair. I said step away. Whitfield's voice had the brittle quality of something breaking. Megan glanced at him then, just for a second. Long enough for him to see the absence of fear in her eyes. Long enough for him to understand, with absolute certainty, that she wasn't going anywhere and that nothing he said would change that. Then she returned her attention to Tate's heart, to the rhythm climbing steadily on the monitor, to the work that mattered more than anything Whitfield could possibly threaten. The room was silent except for the beep of the monitor and the sound of Megan's steady breathing. Cardiothoracic arrived. 2 surgeons, residents, equipment. They took over with the smooth efficiency of people trained for exactly this moment. Megan released her hands, stepped back, and began calmly directing the transition. Rhythm restoration at 23:19. For minutes of cardiac arrest. 2 attempted defibrillations with 0 response. Left anterior lateral thoracotomy performed with direct cardiac massage. Sinus tachycardia achieved for 53 minutes from code initiation. The thoracic surgeon, a woman in her 50s with the bearing of someone who'd seen everything, looked at Megan. Really looked at her. Recognition flickered. Not of her face. Of her competence. Of her knowledge. Of the fact that she'd just performed an emergency procedure that belonged in an operating room, performed it flawlessly, performed it with the kind of precision that suggested significant training. Thank you, the surgeon said simply. Then she turned to Tate and the work of permanent repair. Megan stepped back to the supply area. She was removing her gloves when Whitfield appeared beside her, his face rigid with controlled fury. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The promise in his silence was absolute. By 5 a.m., the chief of staff had called an emergency meeting. By 6 a.m., Megan was in the administrative office with a lawyer, some tired woman in her 50s who looked like she'd been doing crisis management for 30 years. The words on the complaint were precise and devastating: practicing medicine without a license. Performing surgery without authorization. Endangering patient safety. Scope of practice violation. Operating outside her credentials. Whitfield had also made 3 phone calls. First, to the hospital board chairman, a man named Sterling who golfed with Whitfield's father every Saturday and who valued institutional hierarchy above everything. The call took 6 minutes. The complaint was filed within an hour. Second, to the Texas Nursing Board. A formal complaint from an attending physician carried weight. The board would open an investigation. It would take months. But the suspension would be immediate. Third, to a private investigator. Megan's employment history before St. Michael's was suspiciously sparse. 8 months of community college nursing prerequisites visible on the record. Then nothing. No previous employers. No references that checked out. No permanent address before she appeared in Houston. Someone needed to dig deeper. By 6:14 a.m., The chief of staff was visibly uncomfortable but resolute. Hospital protocol. Board pressure. Pending investigation. Immediate suspension without pay. Security escort required for badge confiscation and locker removal. The security officer was a man named Holloway, mid-50s, with the weathered face of someone who'd spent time in uniform before trading it for hospital work. He walked Megan to her locker in silence. Watched her remove her personal items. Her stethoscope. Her trauma shears with the engraved call sign inside the handles. The tarnished military challenge coin from Fallujah that she'd kept hidden in the back corner since her first day, beneath a stack of medical journals no one ever examined. She palmed the coin. Closed her eyes for 2 seconds. That was all the time she allowed herself. The badge came off her neck. She handed it to Holloway without looking at him. They walked to the parking garage in silence. The garage smelled like oil and exhaust and the particular staleness of enclosed concrete. Her car was where she'd left it at 11 p.m. the night before, a 9-hour shift that had transformed into the destruction of everything. She sat in the driver's seat for 41 minutes. Staring at nothing. Her hands on the steering wheel. Still wearing her scrubs. Still wearing Sergeant Tate's blood, dark rust stains on her left sleeve, speckling her right hand where the betadine hadn't fully washed away. Her phone had 83 messages. Military codes. Encrypted channels. A mission status report. An extraction timeline. A debrief schedule that was now obsolete. Her cover was intact. Her mission was destroyed. She had been 72 hours from extraction and instead she'd accelerated everything into a single moment of surgical precision that had just ended her ability to continue the operation. Tate was stable. The intelligence remained unextracted. And somewhere in downtown Houston, Dr. Whitfield was making calls and pulling strings and setting in motion something that neither of them fully understood yet. Megan started the car. Drove to her apartment. Changed into civilian clothes for the first time in 8 months. Sat at her kitchen table with black coffee and the challenge coin resting on her palm, the metal warm from her grip, dented from shrapnel impacts and field repairs, engraved with a date that belonged to a different lifetime. 2 days later, her 8-year-old daughter Emma came home from school to find her mother exactly like that. Still at the table. Still in civilian clothes. Still staring at nothing. Still gripping the coin like it was the only solid thing in a world that had gone liquid. "Mommy, why are you home?" Emma's voice was small. Uncertain. A child sensing that something fundamental had shifted. "Did you get fired?" Megan couldn't speak. So she didn't. She pulled Emma close and held her while her daughter asked again. And again. Getting no answer except the sound of her mother's breathing, which sounded like someone trying to hold something together that was already falling apart. That's when the television in the living room, left on CNN from the previous night, cut to breaking news. "We're following a developing situation out of Houston, Texas, where officials with United States Special Operations Command have announced the compromise of an ongoing undercover operation." Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, a decorated Navy SEAL medic, was conducting classified reconnaissance operations when her cover was compromised at a civilian hospital. The Pentagon is asking for any information regarding her location or status. Her official military portrait from 2019 is on screen now. The screen filled with Megan in dress whites. 3 Navy crosses visible. Her younger face. Her real face. Emma froze. "Mommy, that's you." Security escorted her out at 6 in the morning. The badge clattered against the tile floor as they removed it from her scrubs, the same scrubs stained with Sergeant Tate's blood, still wet in places, dried rust brown in others. She didn't resist. She didn't speak. The guard's name was Morrison, and he'd served in the Navy, and he couldn't meet her eyes as he walked her to the parking lot. The rain hammered the asphalt like applause nobody wanted. She sat in her car for 40 minutes without turning the ignition, the challenge coin from Fallujah pressed so hard into her palm that the eagle embossed on its face left marks in her skin. 3 tours. 18 months of surgical medicine under fire. And they were escorting her out like she'd stolen narcotics. By afternoon, her hands had stopped shaking. That was worse than the shaking. She sat at the kitchen table in those blood-stained scrubs because she couldn't bring herself to take them off, as if removing them would make it real in a way that mattered. The tarnished coin lay on the table in front of her, Fallujah, 2006, Task Force Black engraved on one side, a number she'd long stopped thinking about on the other. 217 lives. That's how many surgical saves she'd logged in 18 months before the shrapnel took her right shoulder blade. She'd kept operating for 6 more hours before letting anyone touch her wounds. The doctors had been furious. The CO had written her up. The medal citation said she'd demonstrated extraordinary valor under fire. Whitfield had called her insubordinate. The rain continued outside, relentless. She didn't turn on the lights. The kitchen darkened into shades of grey, and she sat motionless, her jaw clenched so tightly her teeth ached, her hand steady but her vision blurred in a way that had nothing to do with weakness and everything to do with the cost of secrets. Emma came home at 3:51 p.m., let herself in with her key, and found her mother at the table like a sculpture made of bone and regret. The 8-year-old stopped in the doorway. Megan could feel her daughter's eyes adjusting to the shadows, could feel the moment Emma saw the blood on her mother's scrubs. "Mommy, why are you home? Did you get fired?" The question hung in the darkness like a physical thing. Megan lifted her head. Her daughter's face was small and confused and terrified, and for the first time in 48 hours, Megan allowed herself to feel the magnitude of what she'd lost. Not the career. Not the mission. The promise she'd made to Emma when she'd taken this assignment, that Mommy would be home by dinner time, that Mommy had a boring nursing job, that Mommy was just a nurse. "No, baby," Megan said, and her voice was steady, the voice of someone who'd learned a long time ago that the trembling wasn't fear, it was restraint. "It's complicated." Emma climbed into her lap anyway, and Megan held her daughter while the rain fell and the challenge coin sat on the table like a monument to every sacrifice that nobody would ever know about. 3 days later, CNN broke the story at 4:23 p.m. The hospital's main lobby had at least 40 staff members present when the televisions flickered to life, decorated Navy SEAL medic missing after undercover operation compromised. Megan's official military portrait filled every screen, hair pulled back in regulation tight, eyes that looked like they'd seen the geometry of pain, the kind of composure that came from having already survived the worst. The caption read, "Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien, Navy SEAL Team 3, missing since classified operation ground to compromise." The room went dead silent. Nurses who'd watched her accept humiliation without a word of protest. Residents who'd laughed at the Ice Queen who couldn't handle a real code. Administrators who'd believed Whitfield's carefully constructed narrative. All of them standing in that lobby, watching her military portrait fill the screens, and suddenly understanding that they'd been standing next to a legend and none of them had seen it. The doors to the west entrance opened, and Sergeant Tate walked in flanked by 2 officers in dress uniforms. He was walking, fully ambulatory, color in his face, moving with the controlled precision of someone whose chest had been cracked open 5 days ago and sealed back together by hands that had done it before. He looked directly at Dr. Whitfield, who was standing near the information desk with his coffee growing cold in his fingers. "Call sign, Reaper 6, Tate said. Whitfield's face went white. A security guard, Morrison, the same one who'd escorted Megan out, snapped to attention with the kind of muscle memory that comes from years in uniform. He saluted sharply, fist to chest. "Master Chief Petty Officer O'Brien," he said, his voice carrying through the lobby like an announcement, 3 Navy crosses and a silver star. The elevator doors opened and a 2-star general in dress uniform stepped into the lobby, reading from a leather folder with Megan's name embossed across the cover. His voice was clear and official and left no room for ambiguity. 18 months of combat medicine in Fallujah, attached to Task Force Black. For operations that recovered classified intelligence assets. 217 surgical saves under sustained fire. 17 personnel rescued from hostile territory with direct medical intervention. Service record, exemplary. Commendations, comprehensive. The general closed the folder and looked directly at Whitfield, who was now backing slowly toward the administrative corridor like something hunted. Then Tate stepped forward, a 300-pound Army Ranger who'd coded in VFib 5 days ago, now moving with the power of someone who understood exactly what he was about to say. She took shrapnel meant for me in 2006 and kept operating for 6 more hours before she'd let anyone touch her wounds. 10 seconds of silence. The kind of silence that carries weight. The kind that changes things irreversibly. A nurse near the vending machines began to cry. Someone else gasped. Whitfield reached for the stairwell door, but the general nodded once to the FBI agents who had materialized, seemingly from nowhere, in the corner of the lobby. They moved with the effortless coordination of people who'd done this before, and they moved toward Whitfield like water finding downhill. The arrest itself was anticlimactic. Dr. Whitfield didn't resist. He didn't plead. He simply allowed himself to be cuffed as the agents explained charges: obstruction of justice, falsifying federal documents, evidence tampering in violation of the Intelligence Reform and Terrorism Prevention Act. They read his rights in a monotone that somehow made it worse. The perp walk took him past the third-floor vending machines, the same machines where residents had laughed about the Ice Queen and Whitfield had smiled that predatory smile. It took him past the conference room where he'd used Megan as a teaching moment during grand rounds. It took him through the lobby past 50 staff members who wouldn't meet his eyes. His medical license was suspended before sunset. The hospital administrator who'd helped Whitfield review security footage was escorted out by noon the next day. The board chairman who'd taken his calls resigned to avoid deeper investigation. The FBI found what they'd been looking for in the personnel files: 2 other cases. A physician's assistant fired 3 years ago after Whitfield fabricated performance reviews when she reported him for patient care violations. A male nurse who'd resigned under pressure after Whitfield created false documentation of medication errors. The pattern spanned nearly a decade: institutional violence wrapped in bureaucratic language, weaponizing the same systems designed to protect patient safety. Federal charges carried real weight. Obstruction of justice, 15 years. Falsifying federal documents, 10 years. Evidence tampering in a military intelligence operation, 5 years. The prosecutor noted at Whitfield's bail hearing that he'd continued fabricating evidence even after being informed that Megan was under federal protection, that his actions constituted deliberate interference with an active national security operation. Bail was set at $500,000. His attorney argued he didn't know. The prosecutor proved he did. 2 years later, someone spotted him teaching CPR certification at a Houston Community College basement classroom that smelled like old carpet and broken dreams. $14 an hour. His medical license remained revoked. He was barred from hospital employment in perpetuity. He taught compressions to bored pharmacy technicians and pharmacy students, and nobody he taught ever knew they were learning from a man who'd once been chief of internal medicine, who'd weaponized his authority, who'd tried to destroy a decorated combat veteran to protect his ego. At St. Michael's, the director of Trauma Services office had a tarnished challenge coin displayed prominently on the desk. Fallujah, 2006, Task Force Black. Master Chief Petty Officer Megan O'Brien now ran the trauma department with the same methodical precision she'd brought to the graveyard shift, only now everyone knew why. The coin sat on her desk like a shrine, visible to every staff member who entered her office. She still worked night shifts. She still moved like a shadow through corridors. But now when she moved, people understood it wasn't timidity, it was the absence of wasted motion, the economy of someone trained in environments where efficiency meant survival. Emma, now 10 years old, visited the hospital sometimes after school, wearing her mother's old challenge coin on a chain around her neck, a miniature bronze replica that Megan had kept hidden in her locker at St. Michael's. The girl told anyone who'd listen about the time her mom saved a man's life with her bare hands inside his chest, told them about the raid that came after, told them about the general in dress uniform and the Navy officers, and how her quiet nurse mother had been a Navy SEAL all along. The quietest person in the room might be holding it all together. Megan stood at the nurse's station during a night shift, reviewing charts with the same focus that had saved 217 lives, the same composure that had survived Fallujah and Whitfield and the cost of secrets. Her hand touched the challenge coin once, muscle memory, ritual, acknowledgement, and then she returned to work. A young resident approached with a protocol question and caught himself mid-sentence, suddenly aware that he was asking advice from someone whose experience transcended the scope of a civilian hospital. "Don't apologize for asking," Megan said quietly. "Just make sure you're ready to hear the answers. The quiet ones always are. If you're still watching, hit that like button. And I want to know, would you have saved the man who fired you, or walked away? Drop your answer in the comments. Subscribe and let's see how this ends."